EU exit. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to provide an update on the EU-UK negotiations, including Tuesday's meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee on European Negotiations, where, along with representatives of the Welsh and Northern Irish governments, who were making a welcome return to the forum after 3 years' absence, I discussed the role of the devolved governments in the forthcoming negotiations. Now, I have to acknowledge the desperately sad fact that despite the unambiguous message of the Scottish electorate at both the referendum in 2016 and in subsequent elections, the UK and Scotland will be leaving the European Union at 11 p.m. tomorrow. This is the last full day of membership for Scotland, although we will be back. And after tomorrow night, the UK will become a third country. 1 minute past 11 on the 31st of January may feel no different to 1 minute before 11, but a profound change will have taken place. No one should be lulled into a false sense of security by that initial sameness, because at 1 minute past 11, the clock will start again, ticking inexorably down towards the end of this year, when the UK government insists the transition period must end, and we will feel the full impact of what is the most damaging change to our constitutional settlement in generations. And it'll be ticking down once again to a no deal or something very similar, with all the extra hardship which will entail. The Scottish Government's single overriding concern over the 42 months since the Brexit referendum, in which we did not choose to leave the EU, has been to protect Scotland's national interests. So we will continue, inside and outside the formal structures, to do everything we can to minimise the profound damage that Brexit will inevitably cause. That is why I continue to attend increasingly difficult meetings of the JMCEN. I go there because it's vital that Scotland's core interests and those including the competences exclusively held by this Parliament are always spoken for and protected. It is a fact that the JMCEN terms of reference, agreed jointly by heads of government in October 2016, have so far never been fulfilled. The JMCEN is ostensibly the mechanism by which the four governments seek to agree a UK approach and objectives and have oversight of negotiations, in the words of the protocol, in order to secure joint outcomes. The core problem, Presiding Officer, is that the actions of UK ministers have never matched those commitments, despite the best efforts of the devolved administrations to persuade them to do so. There are many examples of that disrespectful behaviour, too many to list in full. They began as early as January 2017, when the then Prime Minister announced her intention to leave the single market and the customs union in her Lancaster House speech without any consultation, and without even considering the detailed arguments we set out in Scotland's place in Europe only a few weeks before. And it has gone on right up into the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which we only saw in its final form after it had been sent to Westminster to begin its parliamentary process. We know that the UK government departments are now working feverishly on negotiating positions and proposals. Ministers have had no sight of these, despite a formal request made by ourselves and the Welsh Government at the meeting of the JMCEN held in London earlier this month. How can we contribute effectively to the development of the UK negotiating position on the most broad and complex negotiations in living memory, while being left in the dark about the way the UK government are shaping their own approach? The fact is, the UK government has ignored our views and those of the people of Scotland throughout the Brexit process. We have repeatedly tried to alter this pattern. 3 weeks ago at the meeting in London, I acknowledged openly, but with regret, the electoral mandate the UK government has for Brexit, though I continue to think it is fundamentally the wrong approach and will damage Scotland enormously. Regrettably, the UK government has refused to reciprocate and will not acknowledge the clear mandate we received to give Scotland the right to choose. Without mutual recognition of mandates, there can be no trust. But with a mutual recognition of mandates, we can start to move forward. And with that in mind, I also proposed a model for engagement in the second stage of negotiations. That model suggested an approach which allowed detailed discussion of devolved competences and could make a difference if there was also a genuine commitment from all parties to take part and make it work. With a recognition that Scotland will be able to choose this year whether to become an independent country, this model could provide a period of stability in the political structures and allow a more constructive dialogue. But it cannot work if there is no binding commitment to it, through a reformed intergovernmental relationship, the UK government proposals for which have not yet been provided to the devolved administrations despite promises. And alas, the UK government also made the situation worse by two actions in recent days. Firstly, after this Parliament refused on the 8th of January by a margin of 92 votes to 29 to give its consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, the Northern Irish Assembly did the same on the 20th of January and the Welsh Senate followed suit on the 21st. That's a unique situation. But the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union responded by simply confirming that the decision of all three devolved bodies would be ignored. In fact, they went further, insulting our intelligence by profusely supporting in their statements the very convention, the Sewell Convention, they had just buried forever. Then, as the Chamber heard in the debate yesterday, the Prime Minister wrote 2 weeks ago to the First Minister rejecting summarily her request for a Section 30 order, allowing the right of Scotland's people to choose their own future. Presiding Officer, for over 3 years, the Scottish Government has sought to engage with the UK Government in the Brexit process. We've developed and passed primary and secondary legislation for withdrawal. We've ensured that Scotland is as ready as we can make it for exit, however much we oppose and regret that fact. We've played our part. The UK needs to reciprocate. We must move beyond the current process mandated by the UK Government, which does not allow constructive engagement and meaningful input and restricts our ability to protect Scotland's interests. So how do we make progress? These negotiations, like all aspects of our relationship with the UK Government, cannot be treated as business as usual without a mutual recognition of mandates. Once again, we've done our part. The UK must do theirs, and they are enabled to do so afresh by the vote in this Parliament yesterday to take forward a new referendum. Despite the shadow that's cast over the negotiations, I will continue to seek the sort of meaningful engagement with the UK Government that will allow me to protect Scotland's interests. This is now urgent, with negotiations likely to start with Europe in a matter of weeks. At the JMC, alongside my devolved government colleagues, I identified the two essential components of the step change required. First, for the UK to provide the necessary detail of their developing thinking in order to have a meaningful discussion of the UK negotiating mandate. We are ready to have that discussion at the earliest possible moment, but we need the information that they have to be able to contribute in a constructive way. The UK must commit itself to a process, no matter how brief, that is seen to offer the devolved administrations a clear and effective input to that vital final document. Secondly, to give us confidence that in spite of all the previous false dawns, the UK Government will work with us on the negotiations in a way that meets our legitimate expectations and indeed meets the remit of the JMCEN, we need to see the UK proposals for the new relationship between the governments, which are apparently imminent. We must then be given the space as devolved governments together to consider them and to seek changes as required with a view to securing statutory backing for them in order, for as long as we are part of this union, to have a platform for discussion and decision-making. Presiding Officer, it is my sincere hope that this Parliament will support the continued efforts of the Scottish Government to ensure that the legitimate voices of this Parliament and of Scotland are heard in the most important negotiations any of us are likely to witness, and the constructive way we are going about it. There are many things in the Brexit process which we oppose, as well as the entire process itself. We must continue to have the right to argue against the UK Government's reckless decision to rule out any extension to the transition period. Imposing an arbitrary end of 2020 deadline will undoubtedly sacrifice the depth and quality of any future relationship and will result in, at best, a bare-bones agreement that will serve no one's interests. Presiding Officer, it's a stark fact that tomorrow we leave, dragged out against our will despite the clear instruction of the Scottish people. Scotland has the right to choose its own future, and the best option for Scotland is to be an independent country in the EU. In the meantime, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with the rest of Europe around our shared values and interests while doing everything in our power to ensure that none of Scotland's interests are adversely affected in the Brexit process as it continues. That is a mature way to go forward, but it requires the UK to show an equivalent maturity and a respect for democracy. Presiding Officer, Scotland may lie on the edge of Europe. We've always been and want to remain at its heart, and we're committed to doing all we can to getting back to where we belong. As we do so, we ask all of the remaining 27 members to leave a light on for Scotland as we navigate our way out of an incorporating union that does not work for us into a union of equals that does. And we will leave a light on here to guide us back into our European home. We ask the UK to behave like the decent, generous democracy it has been and hopefully will be again, and work with us as friends and neighbours as we make our choices for ourselves.
And thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I have around 20 minutes for questions. Question 1, Donald Cameron, please.
Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of his statement and welcome the fact that his voice is slowly recovering. I noticed a preliminary the Cabinet Secretary recognises the UK Government's mandate for Brexit. As a matter of logic, he must also therefore accept the UK Government's mandate for rejecting another independence referendum. But, Presiding Officer, this statement says nothing new and is yet more grievance and grandstanding in a week when this government has excelled at such practices. And I must confess I expected the statement to contain a number of factual matters and detailed proposals about the practicalities of the next 12 months, which, as he says, will involve the most important negotiations we will know between the UK and the EU, but also a number of UK government bills with a significant impact to the people of Scotland, the first of these being the second reading of the Agriculture Bill. But whether it be fisheries, farming, the environment or trade, these are plainly matters of great import to the Scottish economy as a whole and require to be promoted in a constructive and meaningful way. But it seems incredible that the Scottish Government will not do so, will not engage, unless its constitutional demands are met. How is that protecting Scotland's national interest, to use his phrase? And is it seriously his position that no dialogue between the Scottish and UK governments can occur without the UK government recognising the SNP's demand for another independence referendum? And does he feel comfortable operating such a veto when the livelihoods of so many Scots are at stake?
Cabinet Secretary.
There is no veto being exercised by any organisation except the UK government. They are the organisation exercising the veto, not the Scottish Government, not the Scottish Parliament. And indeed, I know Mr Rumbles is really enthusiastic about being with the Tories, but perhaps he could just pause for a moment and allow me to answer this question. He will have his turn, no doubt. The reality of the situation is I have laid out in my statement today very clearly the way in which we can work together, the structure that we can put in place. Indeed, that structure was proposed by myself. I think it is disingenuous, to say the least, of Mr Cameron to misrepresent that. It is also shameful to deny the right of Scotland to choose its own future. Any politician in this chamber, elected by the people of Scotland, who does that, is not observing democracy. There's always hollow laughter. There's always hollow laughter from Professor Tompkins, particularly when he's uncomfortable with the position that he's holding. And he should be desperately uncomfortable with the position he's holding, because it denies the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future. We will continue to work with the UK government to try and get the best for Scotland. I have laid out the difficulties in that. I would have expected Scottish members of this Parliament to stand with the Scottish Parliament in trying to get, and the Scottish Government, to get the best, but instead they want to stand with the people who are trying to stop that.
Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, I want to make clear that Labour in this Parliament will continue to support the Scottish Government's efforts, along with the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Assembly, to be at the table as equals in order to minimise the damage of Brexit on Scotland. I do think, however, that in his statement the Cabinet Secretary confuses the issues with his obsession with independence. As I made clear yesterday, Labour believes in the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine our own future. And that is why we say there cannot be a referendum anytime soon. The Cabinet Secretary states that Brexit will be the most damaging change to our constitutional settlement in generations. Why then would he want to add even greater constitutional upheaval? And why is he ignoring the wishes of the majority of the people of Scotland, who do not want another referendum in 2020 amidst all the chaos that Brexit will bring?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to Mr Rowley for acknowledging the reality of the situation, that we should all sit round that table as equals. But the sovereign right of the Scottish people to choose its own future isn't a light bulb that you can switch on and off. It is an absolute. And if the Scottish people wish the right and are determined to have the right to talk about their own future, they must have that right. Now, the reason why that must happen in 2020 is very clear. We need to put an end to this uncertainty. And indeed, Scottish business and Scottish industry and Scottish third sector bodies and Scottish higher education all need certainty. And that can be guaranteed this year with the referendum for which we have a mandate. So I think that I'm grateful that the Labour Party is inching towards the reality of this situation, but there is a bit yet to go to recognise both what sovereignty actually is and also to recognise the need to bring this matter to an end as soon as possible.
Can I just ask members on the front bench to desist from making exchanges when I can't hear answers? I now have 10 members wanting to ask questions. Some have not yet pressed the request to speak button. They're on my list. They better press the request to speak button to get them all in. Quick, short, succinct, good questions, yes, of course, but short. I call Annabel Ewing, followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland voted against the withdrawal agreement legislation and consent has been withheld. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether this unprecedented constitutional position has prompted the UK Government to reconsider in any way its entirely disrespectful attitude towards Scotland and the other devolved governments?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, it has not. And indeed, there is considerable annoyance from the other administrations that instead of recognising this fact, there is an allegation from those administrations that from the UK government, none of the administrations voted on the issues in front of them. They only voted on the Brexit issue. And indeed, I know the Welsh have taken this up directly with the UK government, who are very annoyed that instead of it paying attention to the objections to the bill, which the Welsh Parliament had, they've simply tried to gloss over it. There has been no movement on them. And how anybody can actually say we support the Sewell Convention while essentially digging its grave, I do not understand.
Alison Johnson, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. The overwhelming majority who voted for Scotland to remain in the EU will have watched the emotional scenes from the European Parliament yesterday with regret and sadness. And of course, Scotland can become an EU member again as an independent country. But until we get a say on our future, we have to do everything that we can to protect Scotland's interests and public services. So if the Cabinet Secretary's wholly reasonable requests for representation for Scotland in the Brexit negotiations and indeed in other trade deals are ignored, how will his government protect Scotland's NHS from a UK government who, as we approach the cliff edge of the end of the transition deal, will be increasingly desperate to do a trade deal with Trump?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member makes a really good point. We have made proposals about the structure that would work to allow participation in these matters. But it must be a structure in which we all sit together round the table as equals, as Mr Rowley has indicated, and it must be a structure in which we are able to defend our own interests, because there's no hierarchy of governments in devolution, there's a hierarchy of parliaments. We have the responsibility for the Scottish NHS, and we should be speaking up for it and being able to defend it within those negotiations, and that's what we will intend to do. It would be best if the UK government moved from where they are now into a position where they recognise the need to put in place a structure and they are willing to be bound by it in the way that they're expecting us to be bound by it. And we will certainly want that to happen.
Willie Rennie, followed by Tom Arthur.
In this sad moment of division, it is disappointing that the Minister is refusing to cooperate in the interest of Scotland unless the UK government agrees to another divisive independence referendum. I don't accept that the SNP have the support of the majority of people for another referendum.
Just a minute. We got to hear the Cabinet Secretary. We should be hearing everybody else. Please, Mr Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. So I don't accept that the SNP have the support of the majority of people for another divisive independence referendum. So will the Minister remove its referendum boulder so we might have a chance of cooperation and partnership as we enter these trade negotiations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I mean, the member's misrepresentation of my position is as bad as that from Donald Cameron. Not surprising, they are, alas, both Tories of the same mould. The reality of the situation, as we know from his statements yesterday, the reality of the situation is we are endeavouring to find a solution so that we can get the right structure to move forward. And we have made proposals upon that. Now, I hope those proposals can take us there. But it would be a pointless negotiation if I simply went in and said, well, that's it, you do what you want. That may be how Willie Rennie negotiates. It's not how the Scottish Government negotiates.
Tom Arthur, followed by Adam Tompkins.
Presiding Officer, when asked about an independent Scotland's membership of the European Union ahead of the 2014 referendum, the Commission's effective response was to say that they do not comment on the internal affairs of a member state. From 11 p.m. tomorrow, the UK will no longer be a member state. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary that, given the goodwill towards Scotland that clearly exists across Europe, what potential is there for both the Scottish Government and indeed political parties to engage more closely with our European friends and neighbours on both the matter of a future trade deal and Scotland's return to the EU as an independent country?
Secretary.
I think it is clear from all that we have seen this week that there is a huge well of support and sympathy for Scotland in the position we find ourselves now. The important thing is for us to move forward in a legitimate, constructive, constitutional way, recognising how we can re-enter the EU. The EU is never going to say to any country, come away and it doesn't matter who you are, just join in. There is a process to be gone through and we'll go through it. But having had some experience of 2014 and having seen it at very close quarters in the last few years, there is a sea change in attitude. And I am absolutely certain that we will be able to negotiate a beneficial way for Scotland to re-enter the EU.
Adam Tompkins, followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary claims that he has engaged constructively with the United Kingdom ministers. In his trade paper, he demanded for himself no fewer than 5 vetoes over what is a reserved power, international trade. So how is that constructive engagement?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I don't think anybody should have any veto. And if there is no veto applied and no veto from the UK, there should be no veto from anybody else. But, of course, what Mr Tompkins is supporting is a system whereby the UK government, his mates in the Tory party, have a veto on everything we do, and we have no protection at all. That doesn't strike me as a negotiating tactic. That strikes me as a surrender to the UK Tory party, which no doubt Mr Tompkins thinks is a good idea, but very few others in Scotland do.
Gillian Martin, followed by Claire Baker.
Population risks being plunged into decline by hostile Tory immigration policies, and the Prime Minister described the Scottish Government immigration proposals, which have been backed by expert organisations, as fanciful and deranged. In JMC meetings, can the Cabinet Secretary tell me, has the UK Government ever accepted the case for a migration policy tailored towards Scotland's particular needs?
Cabinet Secretary.
We have provided an enormous amount of information to the UK government on a vast range of subjects. I mean, these are just some of the papers that we've published, the information that we've handed, and we've given them lots of information on migration and the needs, the specific needs that Scotland has. But I do want to, and there's been no indication of a change of attitude, but I do want to just touch, Presiding Officer, on Boris Johnson's words, absolutely fanciful and deranged, about a paper he hadn't read. The people who are fanciful and deranged would include then the former Conservative Stirling MP, Mr Kerr, who said they were worth looking at, a leading article in the Times, the President of COSLA, the Policy Chair of the Federation of Small Business, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, the Director of Reform Scotland, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Director of University of Scotland, the Public Affairs Manager NFU Scotland, and the Director of the David Hume Institute, all of whom have supported the publication of these, not necessarily each individual one, but the publication of these and the views that are put forward. So these are the people, not just the SNP. You know, we're obviously deranged, but these people, according to the Prime Minister, are fanciful and deranged. We have, unfortunately, a deranged Prime Minister, if he thinks that.
Claire Baker, followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. We have to rely on reports from the Scottish Government and the UK Government about what happens, and we are entering tough negotiations. Following the JMC, Michael Gove said the Scottish representatives were stressing the importance of making sure we're outside the common fisheries policy. Does the Cabinet Secretary acknowledge that if Scotland was to re-enter the EU as an independent nation, we would have to accept the common fisheries policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I accept is that there's a process of negotiation to be done upon fishing interests and fishing rights. And the attitude of the UK government at the moment is unrealistic within that regard. There has to be, obviously, changes. And it is the Scottish government and this party that has argued for the changes of the common fisheries policy over many, many years. I wish we had been supported by Labour in that matter, because we've talked about the way the CFP needed to change long before the Tories did, because the Tories were enforcing the CFP. That's the reality.
Joan McAlpine, followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you. The Europe Committee of this Parliament wrote to the UK Government asking for information on what will replace the €940 million Scotland will lose with the end of the European structural funds and social funds, which support everything from training young people to small business loans and support for the disabled. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me? These funds must be replaced in full, and this Scottish Parliament must have democratic oversight of how they're distributed.
Cabinet Secretary.
I agree with the member, there's a very worrying situation developing here. If it is true that the final decision on all these matters has to be reached by the end of this year, there are now just 11 months to put in place the Shared Prosperity Fund. Speaking as a former Environment Minister, I was involved when one type of SRDP funding moved to another type, and it took 18 months to get resolved. I don't think there is any... Mr Tompkins, of course, wants to defend that, because he would defend no matter what the Tories did. The Tories will impoverish the third sector, but Mr Tompkins will be in favour of that, because it is the Tories that are doing it. It is an extraordinary position for him to find himself in. It's intellectual gymnastics, which I have to say are not worthy of him in any way. The reality of the situation is that there will be many bodies that will suffer very greatly because the UK government has made as much a mess of this as it has made of all its other responsibilities. We will do our very best to protect the third sector and rural Scotland against that, but unfortunately it is the UK government that is doing something which is absolutely unconscionable in terms of damage it will cause.
And I'll try to get the last two questions in. If they're short, Jamie Green, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Presiding Officer, it's been 24 short hours since the Scottish Government brought forward a debate on the Constitution, but it's been 24 long months since it brought one on education. Doesn't that just sum up perfectly the priorities of Mr Russell and his bench? So let me ask very simply, Cabinet Secretary, why does the Scottish Government continue to refuse to accept that the Scottish people voted to remain part of the UK? Wouldn't that be the democratic thing to do?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, this Parliament last debated education not 2 years ago. That's another, I suppose the word, I can't use the word, but that's what it is. That's another one from the Prime Minister. In actual fact, this Parliament debated education 2 weeks ago. And that's a fact. This Parliament debated education 2 weeks ago. So Jamie Green falls on the first part. Just on the second part, I mean, he may well have been hiding somewhere for the last 5 years. But Brexit changed everything, and indeed tomorrow changes everything. And there has been a material change in circumstance. I know the Tories will not apologise for what they're doing, because they would never apologise for the damage they're doing. But Jamie Green must realise that things have changed profoundly since 2014, and many of the people he knows will say that to him. He's just not prepared to listen to them.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd be keen to hear what the Cabinet Secretary's response is to the views of senior Conservatives who are of the opinion that, quotes, it doesn't matter one jot what the Scottish Parliament has decided.
Cabinet Secretary.
I deeply regret that, because I think that the parliaments and the governments of these islands should be trying to work constructively together, but they're encouraged in that. They're encouraged in that by the attitude of the Scottish Conservatives, regrettably, because the Scottish Conservatives just want to roll over and accept anything they're told to do. And I suspect if you're a member of the UK government, you judge this Parliament by the Scottish Conservatives. I don't think they should do so, because they will find, for example, that these benches are made of far tougher stuff.
Thank you. That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement. We'll shortly move on to the next item of business. Allow the front benches to take their places.